There's such beautiful research on mindsets now about just change the way you think about the things you have to do so you get the things you need from the things you have to do.
Welcome to The One You Feed.
When I saw the title of today's guest's book, Languishing, How to Feel Alive Again in a World That Wears Us Down, I knew this conversation had to happen. Because really, who hasn't felt worn down by life? And as someone who's wrestled with staying connected to what makes me feel alive, this topic hit home. Today I'm talking with Corey Keyes, the researcher who coined the term languishing. It's that space between mental illness and thriving, a state of stagnation that often goes unnoticed. Corey's work explores how we can move from this gray zone into flourishing, where purpose, connection, and vitality live. If you've ever felt stuck in neutral, just getting through your days but not really living them, this conversation is for you. Let's explore what it takes to feel alive again. Hi, Corey. Welcome to the show.
Greetings, Eric.
When I heard the title of your book, I immediately was like, all right, I need to talk to this guy. Sometimes I see a book or we have a guest idea and I send it to my producer, Nicole, and we talk about it and we debate. But every once in a while, I'm like, just book this one. So you were in the just book this one category based on the title, which is Languishing, How to Feel Alive Again in a World That Wears Us Down. And as we get into the conversation, I think we will talk about my own thoughts and challenges around feeling alive. And so it's a topic that means a lot to me. But we'll start like we always do with the parable. And in the parable, there's a grandparent who's talking with their grandchild, and they say, in life, there's two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops, think about it for a second. They look up at their grandparent and they say, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed. So I'd like to start off by asking you what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do.
Well, it means the world to me. I used it in my book, and I have used it in almost every talk, believe it or not, I have given. And I usually use it right at the end, because I use that parable and I talk about the wolf being motivated by fear or love. And that we're feeding the wolf of fear when it comes to illness, disease, and death. And that's where public health and even medicine has been focused. And we're not feeding the wolf that comes from love, health, well-being, what I would call the health span. And I usually end by saying, I'm very hungry to start focusing on health and feeding the wolf of love. Because I think we've been focused too much, believe it or not, on illness and increasing life expectancy and putting death at bay. And yet we're struggling to add healthy longevity to our lives.
Yeah.
And that's what my book is really about when it comes to mental health, adding good mental health rather than focusing only on mental illness.
Wonderful. I'm glad you used that parable, and I'm glad you set us up in that way. I think it gives us a lot of fruitful directions we can go. I want to start off by just asking a question to see if I can orient what you're doing in the context of psychology on a broader sense. Certainly for most of psychology's history, it was focused on mental illness, right? It was solving neuroses and the various different things we called it and all of that. And then there was a period of time where there became a movement called positive psychology that was really about like, well, what does it look like for humans that are thriving? Where is what you're doing oriented in that? It sounds like it's on the positive psychology side, and yet I don't see that as a term that you're using. So help me place you. This is just more for my nerdiness probably than any actually useful conversation, but I can't resist asking.
I straddle both worlds, actually. Because I want to take mental illness very seriously, and I believe we can prevent it by going in the direction that I'm trying to chart, which is focusing on mental health is more than the absence. I was there at the beginning of positive psychology, but long before positive psychology came along, there was the successful aging research networks that came into existence. Easily a decade or more before. And it was funded very generously and graciously by the MacArthur Foundation. And I was one of the members of a very select group of people from around the world that were brought in as young scholars to work with also very senior scholars around the world who were focusing on successful aging, knowing that we were living in an aging world, right? And that we needed to be prepared. And we needed to learn from people who were aging what we were calling successfully. Now, that's a bit of a loaded word, and people are trying to deconstruct it. I don't even want to go there.
Yep.
I know what they were talking about. They wanted to look at how people maintain health and well-being despite the challenges and the losses that come with aging. How do we adapt, compensate, optimize, call it what you want? And if it was not for the MacArthur Foundation that supported this research, which created a longitudinal studies that are still going today, Eric. In 2025, we will have our third wave of data that we will collect on respondents. And this data set is available to people around the world, and they have been mining it for beautiful things that actually fed positive psychology. And I was there at the beginning, but I don't identify much with positive psychology because I didn't know what their why was, what their purpose was. I wanted to focus on the positive so we could address suffering in the world that wasn't being addressed very effectively, and also a problem, if there were, that we weren't even paying attention to. And that's why languishing came into being, because that was a problem that wasn't on anybody's radar. And so, to me, it wasn't enough to say, I want people to be happy. Why? Why? What are you going to fix in the world? And to me, languishing was an unidentified problem. And I also believe that if we promoted what I call flourishing, we could prevent a lot of mental illness. Not all, but a lot of it, because we can't cure mental illness, and we're not even doing a very good job at managing it, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting in your book is this idea of flourishing, and we're gonna define flourishing and languishing here in a second. But was this idea that you can be flourishing, and we'll talk about what that means, and have a mental health condition, and that flourishing doesn't necessarily eliminate the mental health condition, but makes it better or more livable, and can have a certain amount of prevention, but that these things don't have. Being mentally well doesn't mean the absence of all mental illness. It means it also can mean the addition of these positive things. So say what you'd like about that, and then let's maybe define languishing and flourishing before we get too far in here.
I love that you brought that up right away, because it is central. Now, I could go on about all the studies that verify back up what I'm about to say. It's there in the book. But for people who have been and who have mental disorders, depression, anxiety, even schizophrenia, when they experience full recovery, I call full recovery, when they're moving towards flourishing, they're much less likely to relapse or have a recurrence of that mental disorder. And the way I think of it is they stay in recovery, full recovery, far longer. And the way, for me personally, because I have 2 mental disorders, actually 3. When I am flourishing, my mental illness recedes into the background. Indeed, even goes, I put it away in the closet, so to speak. It's there.
Yeah.
Every time I wake up and I go into my closet, I know it's there. It's hanging on the rack, but today I'm not wearing it. Because my life has purpose. I have a sense of contribution. I'm growing. I have all those things that we'll talk about shortly that go into the ingredients of flourishing. So in order to really recover from mental illness, by recovery, as we say in addiction, in the addiction world, you're never fully recovered. You're recovered, but your disease is always there. But it recedes into the background, and what's foreground is your mental health, or what I call flourishing.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I think a lot of people will debate what, and they do debate what recovery in addiction looks like, right? What does that mean? I'm a recovering drug addict and alcoholic, and this time around I'm 16, coming up maybe on 17 years sober. And so I like the way you said it. It's kind of in the closet. In my case, it's way back in the closet. It hasn't been pulled out in years, but I've had experiences in the past when I say this go around means I had sobriety before and then didn't. I tend to believe that it, like you said, it's there. But I think what's so interesting also is in how we define ourselves according to those things. It's easy for me to sort of think of addiction as I've recovered and it's kind of in the background, it's still there. Something like depression is a whole different sort of animal to kind of wrap my head around what's my relationship to it, because it's not, sobriety is easy to measure, just not there, right? You use, you don't use, but things like depression start to look like things that you call languishing, and these are more subtle distinctions. I almost wish that the clarity of addiction was able to bring it to other areas.
I think, for me at least, because I also have depression and alcoholism as well as PTSD, I agree wholeheartedly with you. I mean, the issue of for me, alcoholism is that, in one sense, we all think about, I'm just not picking up, right? Well, it's so much more than that. I mean, it is about regaining a whole different new way of living in a world, right? And that, I think, is true of depression as much as it is of alcoholism, except that I don't love it or hate it for some people. I love my AA program because we do it with each other and for each other, because nobody else can do it for us. And yet when it comes to depression, we've kind of given it over to experts as if I can't really take care of myself. And so sometimes we create a mindset that we catastrophize. When I start to feel sad, I'm thinking, oh no, here comes the beast.
Yeah.
When in fact, it's like, I should just say, wow, isn't that interesting? Just like my Buddhist friend. Oh, I'm feeling sad. Now let's explore that.
Yep.
And let's start talking with some people about this. I have no one to talk about when it comes to depression.
So let me ask a question there, because I've often wondered about this. And as somebody who's been on the inside of the mental health world, something like alcoholism or addiction has these support groups. I mean, I think it's wonderful today that 12-step groups are one of the support group options that are available. There's more of them, but there's a host of them, and people do tend to turn to them for this thing. And I've often wondered, why does that sort of thing not exist for something like depression or anxiety or mental health more broadly? And I'm curious if you have any theories on why. Why doesn't it exist? We see peer support groups pop up in lots of areas, but we just have never seen peer support group gain much traction in this area. And I don't fully understand why.
It's perplexing to me because doctors admitted early on to Bill and Bob that there's nothing I can do for you. That's not the case when it comes to depression. We're given this false sense of hope. And people won't like when I say it, because I'm on those damn medications myself, but they don't cure me anywhere close to it. And yet we have these experts who keep telling me and everyone else, well, I can help you. I can make you better. That wasn't the case for most addictions. And it certainly wasn't the story that I know when Bill and Bob were starting, right? So they had to figure it out for themselves. And yet I don't believe, let me step back. And then we go into therapies with clinical psychologists, and we do all this talking.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not unlike sharing that we do in the rooms, where in NA or AA. And yet, I think because we have this expert out there that we share with, we don't believe that we have much to learn from each other, the other patients. And I think that's such a wrong-headed thing, because I think we've handed over our own ability to help each other to these experts, these clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. And they're necessary, but I don't think they're sufficient.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and theories myself also of why we don't have more of that. I agree, talking to an expert is sharing, but it's a different kind of sharing, right? It's a very different kind of sharing, because generally your psychologist or your therapist or whatever isn't then turning around and going, me too.
Me too.
Me too,
I've
right?
been there.
Oh, I've been there.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, God, just last week I also think that what 12-step programs have, and what a lot of other support groups that I've seen have, is they have a clear defined program. It's not just, talking and sharing and identifying is a big part of it. But there's also, here are the things that we do, right? I think most attempts at peer groups around depression or mental illness lack that. There's not a, yes, I understand you. I recognize what you're doing. You feel heard by me. You feel seen by me. And now you can do the things that I did. I think that's an element of, if you look at what makes some of these programs work, there's the people, the connection, but there's also a program. And you can argue how useful a particular program is. Is the 12 steps the best way? Probably not. But you know what? It's a way, right? It's a path. It's a way of allowing you to take very specific actions in a direction that points, at least for a lot of people, towards health.
It is. And I balk sometimes when I hear people say, well, let's take the AA 12-step kind of approach and apply it to mental illness. I think that itself, Eric, would be a little wrong-headed, because I love the steps because they're so closely allied with the fact that we've reached a level of demoralization and humiliation and a loss of a sense of life that we have to rebuild, that are baked into those steps.
Agreed.
So we have to redeem ourselves, reclaim ourselves. And I don't see, mental illness has enough of the morality issues hanging over it to stigmatize it. So we need to really think anew when it comes to a program that would be step-like for depression and anxiety. But I think we could if we really put ourselves to the task.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, the 12 steps, I would argue, even for a lot of people who have addiction issues, may not even be the right path, right? But certainly people who are wrestling with severe depression don't need to be focusing on their character defects, right? Like they've got that pretty well sorted.
Yes.
All right. So this is a rabbit hole we could spend the whole conversation on.
Goodness, yes.
And I'd love to just sit here and brainstorm what this program looks like. But we're gonna move on so that this we get sort of re-anchored here a little bit. And I want to talk about languishing. So what is languishing? Give us the history of sort of how it evolved for you as a way of thinking, and what it is, and how is it different from other things that it sort of looks like?
Yeah. Well, let's start with that last part of your question. For most people, it seems a lot like depression. Even, shall we say, minor depression. Let's first distinguish it, and then I want to jump back into how they blend together.
Okay.
The first thing is, depression is the presence of negative symptoms. If we were to look at the psychiatric manual, we would see the presence of negative emotions and a loss of interest in life, and then several forms of malfunctioning, really problematic functioning.
Mm-hmm.
Languishing is the absence of very positive things, very positive symptoms. So what you're missing are the feelings that come around what we might call joy, happiness, interest in life. And interest in life is the only overlapping symptom. Right,
yes.
And then the rest are what I call these signs of functioning well. Functioning well, I measure purpose. Does your life have direction and meaning? I measure a sense of contribution. Are you contributing things of worth and value to your family, community, workplace, sense of growth, and so forth? So you can be free of negative things, right? That go into depression, and not have any of the positive things either. And that's an interesting category, because that's why I've used the phrase, and Adam picked up on what I've used in my talks, that why languishing is the middle child in between things like depression and flourishing. It's stuck there right in the middle. There's a lot of people who are free of negative symptoms like anxiety and depression. They might have a few, but they don't meet the criteria for a diagnosable disorder. And yet they don't meet the criteria for flourishing either. They're stuck in the middle. But by the same token, here's where things get really confusing. Because clinicians want to tell me languishing is part of depression, and I say, yes, it is. For most people with a mental disorder, they're languishing to some degree. Mildly, moderately, or sometimes severely. Just because you've gone into the realm of a mental disorder doesn't mean you've left languishing at the door. It comes along with you. And often it's the gatekeeper. It's often why people end up with mental illness. And so here's the thing. You could be depressed and languishing at the same time. Most people are. And yet here's the mystery to me. We attribute all the problems that people with a mental illness have to their mental disorder, when languishing is there causing easily half, if not more, of the problems. It's not just depression causing the problem. It's the languishing that comes along. It's also causing the problem. And so you can have both.
Okay. So I want to spend some time here because I'm really interested. Let's just say, I recognize there's a lot of overlap, and there can be a lot of overlap. You talked about depression being a lot of negative symptoms and poor functioning, right? And I love the idea you made this fact that you can, with certain people, you can remove a lot of, and I would say this is the case for me, right? Like the real gross levels of suffering are gone, right? I mean, I used to be a homeless heroin addict, right? I'm so much better. I used to suffer with depression that made it hard to get out of bed. I never have that problem, right? That's not what I'm talking about at all.
Yeah.
And in my more honest moment, right, if I were to chart my journey, I would say something very similar to what you said, which is I've gotten rid of the real suffering. And I think if you put the 23-year-old me in my brain, he would think he was enlightened, right? He would just, the difference is so stark. But the 53-year-old me doesn't know as much about joy and peak moments of happiness and all these different things that he would like. You know, I figured out how to eliminate a lot of suffering, but I haven't figured out how to strongly amplify good feelings. Now, here's where things get tricky. I'm a former heroin addict, right? I'm a former drug addict. To me, feeling good is way up here, right? Like I have this idea in my mind, you should feel like that. People don't feel like they feel like when they're on heroin. Like that's not normal day-to-day functioning. So where I get caught up a lot is going, okay, when we talk about having more joy, more positive emotions, what are we talking about? What's the reasonable level of someone? And that's where I kind of get hung up, and I don't know what to say. Am I languishing? If you look at functioning, And a lot of your book is about functioning, right? A lot of your book is about functioning. If you look at functioning, I'm in no way, shape, or form languishing. My life is filled with purpose. I play, I learn. I mean, all your vitamins, connection, like I function, I think, at a pretty high level on all those things. But my mood is not like way up there, right? It's in this sort of grayer area. So is that languishing? Is that flourishing? And like I said to you before, sometimes I'm like, well, maybe that's just my temperament. Maybe I need to stop monkeying with it all, worrying about it, and just go, you know what? That's just kind of who you are. That's, so I love this topic. I love the nuance of it, but I also dislike the ambiguity of it when it comes to trying to sort things out in my own head.
Yeah, the feeling, functioning thing, that's a real challenge for us who are trying to come off of this artificial, almost explosive dopamine rush that you can't get anywhere else. Right? You just can't. It takes a long time to recalibrate that. And for many of us, I don't think it takes a lifetime.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you quite want to trust it, because there is this sneaking suspicion, even if you're just feeling it and you're not using it, you're like, oh boy, I shouldn't go down there. But having said that, even though I would call what you're experiencing some degree of languishing, there's interesting combinations that are worth mentioning here. Now, when I split apart the criteria for feeling good versus functioning well in my research, let's nerd out just a little bit so I can get to your point. There was 12 to 13% of U.S. college students who would be flourishing according to my criteria when it came to functioning well. That meant that every day or almost every day, they experienced at least 6 out of the 11 signs of functioning well. But they did not meet the criteria for feeling good because they didn't report either interest in life, happiness, or satisfaction with life every day or almost every day in the past 2 weeks or past month. That group, I have the data right here. 13% of them had one of 3 mental disorders in the past 2 weeks, compared to less than 4% of those students who were flourishing, who put the feeling good with the functioning well. Now, every study I've ever done, Eric, when you're flourishing, when you meet the criteria for feeling good, you just have to have 1 out of 3 interested in life, satisfied, or happy every day or almost every day. Just 1. Combined with at least 6 out of 11 signs of functioning well. They're always doing better than the group, even the group that's functioning well, they're flourishing when it comes to functioning well. But here's the interesting thing. There's an even larger group of young people who would meet the criteria for flourishing only when it came to feeling good. But they're not flourishing when it comes to functioning well. Now that group too that's almost 25% of the U.S. college student population. They feel good about a life where they're not functioning well. Their life doesn't have purpose, belonging, contribution, growth, and all that. 21% of them met the criteria in the past 2 weeks for depression, anxiety, or a panic attack, compared to less than 4%. But it gets worse the more severe you're languishing. It's better to be flourishing in at least 1 out of the 2 than it is to have moderate to severe languishing. But it's always better, Eric, to be flourishing. For some reason, that combination is just magical. So you're doing well, and I know those moments you're describing where I'm functioning well, I'm growing, I'm learning, but there's a lot of times when you're functioning well that you've had to go through a lot of effort to get there, and it doesn't feel good. Eric, growth is not necessarily everything it's cracked up to be. It doesn't create happiness. So those people, it makes sense. They're not, when it comes to mental illness, they're not doing as well as those people who are flourishing. But it's always better than having severe languishing, trust me.
Right. And I think where this gets even more tricky. I guess there's two things I want to push on here. The first is when we say things like interest in life. Well, how interested? Right? Like, you know what I mean? Yes, like this is really, to me, very subtle. Like, I would say I'm interested in life, but I'm not. Am I interested in the way that like peak moments of and that's where I sort of get hung up is like, well, what it's this question of what is enough, right? With anything. And then I think the second thing that's really interesting, and I've thought a lot about this since I had the conversation. I had the conversation with the psychologist Paul Bloom, and he talked about two sort of ways that people measure well-beings generally. And the one is you ask people how satisfied they are at intervals. You say, how satisfied are you with your life in these various areas? And people report things. The other is you ask people, how are you feeling right now? Mm-hmm. Right? How are you feeling right now? And so what I think is interesting is that you can have a gap between those things. You can have people who say, I'm satisfied with my life. My life is good. Right? I would fall into this category. Yeah. I'm satisfied. I mean, my life is great, right? Like, I mean, in so many ways, my life is outstanding. But if you ask me at certain moments, how do you feel? I might say, I mean, that would be my reaction. And this gets to also thinking about like, what is our mood system wired up to look like? Does everybody have the same capacity or, I've heard about like happiness set points or, where do these things land? And so again, it gets to this question of, because I also think that when we start to take on labels, that gets interesting. It's a different perspective. It's a different way of viewing myself in the world if I say, I'm very satisfied with my life. Things are going really well. The things that matter to me are all in place. And you know what? I have sort of a lower than average mood system. Mm-hmm. Versus to say, I'm languishing.
Yeah.
Right? Like that difference there matters in how I see and view myself. And I'm just, I don't mean to turn this into a conversation about me, but I'm like your languishing, I'm sort of I'm close to the target audience. Now, there's a lot of people who are languishing much more severely, right? And I think I want to turn my attention to that in a second. But I think what we're talking about are these sort of edge states. And I'm just curious how you think about those things for yourself, because I suspect you're similar.
I go round and round with psychologists about this. There's, some people like Daniel Kahneman wanted to say there's experienced happiness, which is valid. And then there's remembered happiness, which is, I can't trust it. Right?
Exactly. Yes.
Right. Well, my take on that always is we're storytellers. We don't, for you, sometimes 10 moments in one day of happiness will not equal the summary that this was a good day. Because you could have been dedicating yourself to moments of happiness that had very little meaning to you, yet they felt right at the moment. If I recorded your experience, it felt good because I was working on something interesting.
Or conversely, I could have slept bad last night and be working on really meaningful things and just sort of been like, I didn't feel great, but I was there, right? I did what mattered to me.
Yeah, but you did it, and you did it to the best of your ability, and you could end up saying, well, that was a day well spent. That was a really good day, even though, it didn't feel great.
Yeah.
So to me, human beings, life is not made up of moments, even though it is in reality. And whether we have peak moments or valleys, I think the way stories end matter.
Yeah.
And I had this argument with Kahneman because I do think endings matter. So if an ending is really triumphant and everything up to that was miserable, you're telling me it's invalid for me to say this, my story is, to me, a really good one. I feel really good about it, even though I suffered most of it. I prevailed. And I argued with it. I was like, no, moments where we start our peaks and our lows and where it ends matters greatly to human beings.
Yeah, it seems to be based on all studies. That's what we affix. And then I think there's also the whole idea of, what meaning do we give to certain things? Is what's most important how I'm feeling? Or which is transient and affected by 1,000 things. It's affected by the weather outside. It's affected by how I slept. It's affected by how many carbs. Whatever your thing is, right? 1,000 factors. And yet the things I do in the world that matter, that have meaning, those are different, right? They're not based on mood. And I'm always, at least for me personally, I've tried to orient myself away from mood being the driving factor in my life. Because if you have a mood system like me, that could be rocky territory. Whereas values and what matters, that's a place I can affix my attention to that really steadies things and allows me to your point, to have a story that feels like it's important.
And to get to your other point about trying to get granular about sort of the questions I ask, I decided early on I would use these terms, but not get in the business of trying to create an objective metric or even think I could get inside somebody else's head. Mm-hmm. If you say that almost every day in the last 2 weeks, I felt interested in who am I to get in the business of saying, well, okay, now it's got, I'm going to get real granular on you. Now, your interest might be at a different sort of objective level than mine, but when I can come to that conclusion, I'm probably the best judge in many respects than anyone else.
Yep.
And so all I can say, and some people would say I'm punting, I'm going to allow you to make that assessment. And all I can say is in the scientific world, when people actually meet these criteria, it is remarkable to see how much better or how much worse they are doing.
Yep.
And I'm telling you, it's over 30 years now of research. Nobody's come up with a better diagnostic set of criteria for good mental health, flourishing or languishing, that could replace where I just started. It was a starting point. And by the way, what I did was take depression and literally turn it on its head when I looked at all the signs and symptoms of well-being. So you had to have 1 out of 2 anhedonia combined with 4 out of the 7 malfunctioning to meet the criteria for depression every day or almost every day.
Yeah.
When I looked at all the well-being measures and reduced them down to the 14 questions in my questionnaire, you have to have 1 out of the 3 feeling good almost every day, or combined with at least 6 out of the 11 functioning well, 7 out of 14. Any combination, the beauty of my diagnosis, there's multiple ways people can flourish. There's multiple ways that people can languish.
So listener, consider this your halfway through the episode integration reminder. Remember, knowledge is power, but only if combined with action and integration. It can be transformative to take a minute to synthesize information rather than just ingesting it in a detached way. So let's collectively take a moment to pause and reflect. What's your one big insight so far, and how can you put it into practice in your life? Seriously, just take a second, pause the audio, and reflect. It can be so powerful to have these reminders to stop and be present, can't it? If you want to keep this momentum going that you built with this little exercise, I'd encourage you to get on our Good Wolf Reminders SMS list. I'll shoot you 2 texts a week with insightful little prompts and wisdom from podcast guests. They're a nice little nudge to stop and be present in your life. And they're a helpful way to not get lost in the busyness and forget what is important. You can join at oneyoufeed.net/SMS, and if you don't like them, you can get off the list really easily. So far, there are over 1,172 others from the One You Feed community on the list, and we'd love to welcome you as well. So head on over to oneyoufeed.net/SMS, and let's feed our good wolves together.
And that's the thing. When I sit down with people and try to help them, I get the questions out and I put them in front of them and I say, you don't have to be doing well in all of these things. Just 7 out of the 14, and they have to be at least 1 out of the feeling good and 6 or more out of the functioning well. And by the way, the only thing I will recommend, focus on functioning well, because you will feel good when you reach that level of functioning well, and it will be based on something sustainable.
Yeah.
Not external to you. You will know that your effort is what, and your accomplishments are creating that feeling good. Because normally, and I studied this in young people, they put feeling good before functioning well.
Sure.
They value feeling good way over functioning well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find a way to feel good without functioning well, trust me, most people are going to stick with that course.
Well, sure. And generally it's a road that has an end to it, right? Meaning there are ways to feel good without functioning well. I mean, you and I have explored,
we've
explored them, I mean, I took that,
Yes.
I took that seeking about as far as you can take it. Right. And it didn't end well. So let's talk about, what do we mean by functioning well? What are we talking about when we say someone is functioning well?
Well, there were 6 criteria called psychological well-being, because they focused primarily on the pronouns, not protons, the pronouns me and I. So there's self-acceptance. Do you like most parts of your personality? There's positive relations, which is, do you have warm, trusting relationships with other people? Mm-hmm. There's a sense of personal growth. Are you being challenged to grow and become a better person? Mm-hmm. There's something called mastery, which is, are you able to manage the daily responsibilities of your life? Mm-hmm. There's autonomy, which is, do you feel confident to think and express your own ideas and opinions? And last but certainly not least, purpose in life. Does your life have meaning or direction to it? And then there's 5 qualities or criteria called social well-being that privilege the pronouns we and us. So there's self-acceptance on this self side. There's acceptance of other people. Are you trusting, or do you view other people with some sense of trust? Do you believe that other people are basically good by nature? There's a thing called coherence. Are you able to make sense of what's going on in the world around you? Your society, your community, the world. It's called coherence. I know that. Trust me.
What's that old saying? It's not a sign of wellness to see a sick society as healthy.
Yes.
Whatever that is.
To be well adjusted to a sick society. Yes. Yeah. There's a sense of integration. Do you have a sense of belonging? Do you have a community? There's a dimension called social contribution. Do the things you do on a daily basis matter to the world around you, to other people? And last is the sense of social growth. We're members of teams, literally and figuratively. Are we being challenged? Do I feel like I, as a member of something, am I being challenged to grow as a better member of something? And so those are 11 signs of functioning well. And you can have 6 from any of either group. But you just need 6 or more, at minimum of 6, almost every day. And I toyed early on in my research, you had to have a few from social well-being, some from psychological well-being. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter. Having said that, and this is an interesting thing, almost everywhere we've looked in the world, social well-being is the hardest thing for people to achieve. Almost every day.
Yeah, I believe that. I mean,
it's really the hardest thing for us social animals, believe it or not.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, there are days that my social life is very fulfilling and rich, and there are other days that I sit here and I'm working on a book, so I spend most of my day writing, and then I see my partner and we're doing fine and we have dinner, but there's nothing really that it's like, all right, well, like there's just not a lot of social interaction in that day. It's not necessarily a bad day,
no.
but it's just not the that's the way I think a lot of our lives are. All right, let's turn our attention to. I'd like to talk about what are the vitamins of flourishing? What are the 5 sort of things that people can look at doing or investing in that add up to flourishing? And I assume what you're saying is, if you do these, if you integrate these things into your life to some degree, then you're going to answer yes to more of those measures of well-being that we just talked about.
You will.
The essence of it?
This comes from a study, longitudinal study that followed these folks who were either depressed, not depressed but languishing, or they were flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was that regardless of your category, if you were doing more of these 5 things, now you don't have to do them all in one day, but if you picked one of them, which was either play, learn something new, some form of spiritual or religious activity, helping others, and connecting or socializing, if you did more of one of those things the day prior to the interview, you recorded and had a much better day. And even if you were depressed or languishing, if you continued over time to do more of those 5 vitamins on a daily or weekly basis, you began to move out of those places. Now, you didn't jump all the way to flourishing. It takes time. We don't know the exact amount of time, but the good news was you began to move up the continuum closer and closer to flourishing. But here is the thing. If you were flourishing and you stopped doing those things, it didn't take long, and you began to drift away into languishing. I call that the couch potato effect. Doesn't matter if you're flourishing. You can't just say, I'm flourishing and I'm going to put that in the bank. Now I'm going to ignore all those things that got me there because I got something more important. Like I got work, I got careers, I got success to tackle. And I'm going to leave all those things behind because they're a waste of my time. People at my workplace don't really care about those things. Well, guess what? Well, if you don't care about them, of course they don't. And before you know it, you're languishing. So those 5 things were very clearly addressing a deficiency in flourishing, whether you were depressed or languishing. And I think of languishing kind of like the physiological equivalent of anemia.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It feels like that too, because trust me, the way I found out that I had celiac disease is I became very anemic. I didn't know it. And one day I was up there hiking with my wife, and I could not make it back to our car. She put me on the side of the road, went back, got the car, picked me up. I said, something's wrong. And I went to the doctor, and I was very low in iron. And she said, there's only one of 2 reasons. You're bleeding internally, or you're not taking up iron because you've got celiac. Your little intestines has been destroyed. Boom. Yes. And so when I thought about my celiacs and what I had done to and how it felt, languishing is essentially a deficiency of those 5 vitamins.
Okay, so let's dive into those 5 vitamins a little bit. And I think I want to go to something you said kind of at the end there, which is like, okay, I'm doing these things. I decide I'm going to put them in the bank, and I'm just going to focus on other things like work or success. Or I think the thing of it, though, is that the wise approach seems to me that you integrate those things into the work that you do, into the success that you seek, into, they become the way in which you approach things, right? I approach my work from a perspective of what can I learn today here, right? There's opportunities to learn there. Who can I connect with here today, right? Like, I think that we often think that we have to go do these other things in other places in other ways. And where so many people get hung up is there's no time to do that. There's no time if you're going to work, which most people have to do. If you have, let's say, children, or the flip side of it, parents who need care, or both, where a lot of people find themselves. It's so hard to get time away to do things. So we have to think, at least for me, strategically about how do I integrate these approaches to things into my day-to-day life.
I love that you bring that up, because I remember I was just marveling at Epicurus, the great philosopher of hedonism. I read about him in the book, and he said, what you really need in life are three things: friends, freedom, and by freedom he meant really autonomy, to do as much for yourself as you can and for each other, rather than giving over your life to a boss. And then the last one is examine life. When things go bad, you need time to reflect and learn. Now, everyone said, Epicurus, this is so obvious. Why did you put that on the Stoa, right? He wrote, and he said, well, tell me, if it's so obvious, why don't you do these things?
Exactly. Yes.
You need constant reminders. He said this again and again. Human beings need constant reminders because we are so easily led to believe something else is so much more important.
Yeah.
So much more important. And people have said this about my 5 vitamins, and I think back and I'm like, oh my God, you think this is obvious? Then why don't you do it? Why do you think you can only do 5 minutes of it and it's done?
Yeah.
No, you have to do exactly what you said. Create a mindset. There's such beautiful research on mindsets now about just change the way you think about the things you have to do, so you get the things you need from the things you have to do.
So, okay, I love that. But I have to ask, when you talk about some of this research on mindset, is there any places you could point me?
Oh, there's several that I talk about in the book. There's this wonderful young scholar, but she's out in Stanford in psychology, Aliyah Crum.
You just freaked me out, because the conversation I've recorded an interview before this, and the woman was a mentor of that woman, and I've never heard her name till now, and now I've heard it twice. No, she's a mentee of that woman. She's a younger student that has worked with Aliyah, but I've never heard. What's her name? Carrie Leibowitz.
Was her name Carrie?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my student.
Oh, well, hell.
She was my student.
Look, I've never heard.
She's in my book as well, and I taught. Yeah.
I've never heard of Aliyah Crum until like an hour ago, and okay. But all right, that is fascinating. All right, let's come back to what you were just saying, which is, talk to me about this idea of taking what we quote unquote think we have to do, which we actually don't in a lot of cases, right? There's no law that requires we do certain things. Talk about reclaiming autonomy there and using that to give us some of the things that we need for flourishing, because I think this is a really key point.
Yeah, and there was this. Oh, I just love this study. They when Aliyah was working with Ellen Langer, who's a psychologist at Harvard, who said, right, they were looking for a group of people who do some very physically demanding work, yet probably don't view their work as exercise. And they chose among a group of people who take care of the hotel rooms, right? Mm-hmm. Clean and do all that work. And did an intervention, and they did an assessment of all the physical activities they did, and then looked at the Surgeon General's report. And it was very clear that these mostly women, almost all women, were easily surpassing the Surgeon General's recommended physical activity for every day.
They're moving all day.
All day. Yep. And yet they do not view their work as exercise. Mm-hmm. And so Langer and Crum decided to work with these women and create a mindset intervention with one group and said, look at what you're doing here. You're lifting this and doing this. And they intervened to help them look at not just the work, what the physical activity they were doing. And lo and behold, adding the mindset that their work isn't just work, it's also physical activity that's very healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Change their physical biomarkers in health.
I know. That's crazy.
And it wasn't because they went and got a gym a membership or started eating differently. It was, and there's lots of research on this now, that if you change your mindset about what you're doing or what you're eating, it doesn't mean ignoring the reality of what you're doing and trying to romanticize it. It's simply adding layers of nuance to the reality that most of the time we're doing one thing that has 10 or more different elements, and we only look at it one way.
Yes. Carrie and I, in our previous conversation, talked about this very idea, right? And I think it's a really important one, which is this idea that reality isn't just what actually occurs or what the facts are, nor is reality all what we think about reality. It's a co-creation of those things. Exactly. And to your point, every situation you can look at from multiple angles. And, I talk about this a lot. Listeners of the show will have heard it. This idea of, like, when I realized at one point, I was like, I found myself saying to myself all the time, I have to do X. And the example I often give is I have to take my son to soccer practice. I have to take him here. I have to take him there. And one day I went, wait a second. No, I don't. No. There's no law in the books that a father has to take his son to soccer practice. That's preposterous. So I'm doing it. Why am I doing it? Oh, I'm doing it because I care about his well-being. I care about his happiness. I think playing team sports helps him develop, or whatever the things are. All of a sudden, the exact same activity has gone from something I have to do to something I'm doing out of a value that I have. And, this is kind of what you're saying. When we take the right mindset about what we're doing, when we take the right mindset about what we do in our lives, our lives can look very, very different without anything changing. It's not to say that sometimes things don't need to change. They do, of course. And there's a lot of change that can happen by looking at things differently. And I love your 5 vitamins because they give them a lens. They give us a lens, right? We can look at can I take what I'm doing and is there a way that it fits into a learning category or a connecting category or a transcending category or a helping category, or is there a way to make this thing a little bit more playful? It gives us it gives us sort of, almost, to use the words we were just using, 5 mindsets that I might slot things into that suddenly give them a value they didn't have before.
Love it. And this is when I talk to businesses and workplaces, I think of managers as also sort of co-creators of this reality as well. An opportunity, right? You don't have to change much, but maybe a little about the workplace to add these vitamins to people's lives. And it is a win-win, because the evidence was very clear that languishing was costing businesses as much, if not more, than depression was.
Yeah, I believe it. And
it was costing them a lot. Yeah. Missed days of work and presenteeism is right. They were there, but they weren't really there.
And there's a cynical view of all that has taken place a little bit that I understand and I also don't fully agree with. And that cynical view is that companies are investing in wellness only to serve their bottom line. And that may or may not be true. But the fact is, if you can bring wellness into where you spend most of your time as a worker, that benefits you. It doesn't matter what the underlying reason is. We spend so much time at work, we have to find a way to embody it with meaning and purpose and your 5 vitamins, right? Because most of us don't have an option but to be there or something similar to it, right? Mm-hmm. We just don't right now. And So I think this viewing all of this workplace wellness with cynicism, I understand, right? You don't want to use workplace wellness as just a way to convince you to spend more and more of your life at work. That's not it. But it can be used to say the time that I spend there, how do I make it more meaningful? And that benefits the employer and it benefits everyone.
I played that game politically and scientifically. I mean, it's very clear. I could throw out all the statistics of how, and scare everyone who's listening to this, that languishing is one of a pretty potent cause of all-cause mortality for females and males.
Yeah,
it's very clear. It will, and there's good biological reasons for that I talk about in the book. It's a very strong risk factor for a variety of mental illnesses, depression, anxiety, even PTSD in frontline healthcare workers we found during COVID. And I could go on and on. I mean, and it's deeply genetic. I mean, it's all there. It's like, I'm okay. Now the question is, I'm not going to play this cynical game because I know in order to get places like the National Institute of Health interested in this, you have to show all those things.
Yeah, yeah.
If it shortens lives, if it's genetic, it has biological biomarkers, it has neuroscientific substrates, it's all there. Now, it also addresses the bottom line of a very important one that nobody's paying attention to. Nobody. And we need to raise awareness because there's so many more people languishing who have mental illness.
Yeah.
And the sheer amount of people eclipses and causes a lot more problems for the world.
Yeah.
Economically, socially, educationally, than mental illness. It eclipses it. And if we want to deal with the burden of mental health problems along with mental illness, we're going to have to deal with this problem languishing. So it's a bottom line issue.
Yeah.
For public health, for medicine, for workplaces, and it is for you, dear listener, you and your family and yourself. It's a bottom line issue.
Yeah.
And we ignore it to our peril because it's a problem.
Yep. Given the genetic nature of it, for some of us, languishing is a big step up from the previous genetic generations. I'll take it. No, I'm just
What's remarkable
I'm mocking
about that,
my ancestors. It's a joke.
Yeah. The genes, and we've shown this, that we inherit for flourishing or languishing operate more or less independently from the genes we inherit for mental illness. And again, we're back to the wolf you feed.
Yep.
Because it's about epigenetics and environments. And we're feeding that wolf of illness and we're trying to lower genetic risk when we're ignoring what resides over here in the parable, which is the genetic potential.
Yeah.
And we're not even there. But my point is, we've shown this in our research that they operate kind of independently.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that wins is the one that gets attention and gets fed. And we're not paying attention at all to genetic potential for flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's my dream. Before I pass on to some other spiritual realm, that I see somebody who actually sees this for what it is. It's like, why aren't you feeding that wolf?
Let's wrap up here because we're about the hour mark, and I want to end on what you just said, which is where you tied things back to the parable, and I'd love if you could just take us out with one, like what is one very basic way that an individual listening to this show could feed the wolf of flourishing. Let's end there. And then in the post-show conversation, I want to explore a little bit of what you said about what we're not paying attention to. I think that's interesting, but I want to leave listeners with something that they can take away as a way of feeding the wolf of flourishing.
Languishing is a normal response that can become problematic if we don't listen to it, because I call it the existential alarm clock. When you start to feel that creeping in, that emptiness, that numbness, that feeling of starting to die inside, it's telling you you've left behind something that's very good for you that you need, that was feeding your flourishing. Now, sometimes we have to do that, but don't ignore it for too long, because it is an alarm clock that if you keep hitting the existential snooze button, you will languish in a way that's pathological. It's very dangerous. So listen to it, because it's telling you are leaving behind the very things like that go into the vitamins and also go into the ingredients of flourishing that feed your spirit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Corey. Like I said, you and I are going to talk in the post-show conversation. And listeners, if you'd like access to that, where we're probably going to nerd out on some things, if you like that part of what we do, become a member of our community at oneyoufeed.net/join, and you can hear Corey and I nerd out on that stuff. And thanks, Corey. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
If what you just heard was helpful to you, please consider making a monthly donation to support the One You Feed podcast. When you join our membership community with this monthly pledge, you get lots of exclusive members-only benefits. It's our way of saying thank you for your support. Now, we are so grateful for the members of our community. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without their support, and we don't take a single dollar for granted. To learn more, make a donation at any level, and become a member of the One You Feed community, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. The One You Feed podcast would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for supporting the show.